The courtroom was quiet, except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzing above. It wasn't a grand or impressive space, just a small, dimly lit room on the third floor of a courthouse in downtown Chicago. The walls were covered in dark, wooden panels that had seen better days, scratched and worn from years of use. Rows of hard wooden benches lined the sides, though most of them were empty this morning. Only a few people sat scattered around. An elderly woman knitting in the corner, a young man scrolling through his phone, and a bailiff leaning against the wall near the exit, arms crossed. At the front of the room, Judge Harold Whitaker adjusted his glasses as he flipped through some papers on his desk. His graying hair stuck out awkwardly under his black judicial cap, and deep lines creased his face, evidence of decades spent dealing with difficult cases. Today's docket was supposed to be simple, a traffic violation case. But even routine, hearings could drag on longer than expected. Whitaker sighed heavily, tapping his pen against the edge of the table. He hated these kinds of cases. They felt like a waste of everyone's time. In the defendant's area stood Marcus Johnson, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 30s. He wore a neatly pressed navy blue suit, paired with a crisp white shirt and a red tie. His shoes were polished to a shine and his posture was straight, almost military-like. Despite the seriousness of the situation, there was no hint of panic or nervousness in his expression. Instead, he looked calm, but not entirely happy. There was a flicker of irritation in his eyes, barely noticeable unless you were paying close attention. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Whitaker began, his voice carrying just enough authority to fill the room. "You've been charged with reckless driving, specifically speeding in excess of 20 miles per hour over the posted limit. Is that correct?" Marcus nodded once before speaking. "Yes, Your Honor. I admit I was speeding, but I wouldn't call it reckless. I was late for work and made a mistake." Whitaker frowned at the word mistake. People always tried to downplay their actions in court, as if saying they didn't mean to do something would magically erase the consequences. "Late for work?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That's hardly an excuse, Mr. Johnson. Speed limits exist for a reason, to keep everyone safe. If everyone decided they could ignore the rules whenever it suited them, we'd have chaos on our roads." Marcus kept his tone steady, refusing to let frustration seep into his voice. "I understand that, Your Honor, and I take full responsibility for my actions. But I also want to point out that I've never had any prior offenses. This is the first time I've ever been pulled over for anything." Whitaker glanced down at the file in front of him. Sure enough, Marcus's record was clean. No tickets, no arrests, nothing suspicious at all. For a moment, the judge considered giving him a lighter sentence, a warning, or maybe a small fine. But then he remembered how many times he'd heard similar excuses before. Everyone thought they deserved special treatment, especially when they dressed nicely and sounded educated. "You seem to think your good behavior up until now should exempt you from punishment," Whitaker said, his tone sharp. "But laws apply to everyone equally, regardless of their background or circumstances. Reckless driving is a serious offense, Mr. Johnson, and it needs to be taken seriously." Marcus clenched his jaw briefly, resisting the urge to argue further. Arguing with a judge rarely ended well, and he knew better than to push his luck. Still, he couldn't help feeling that Whitaker was being unnecessarily harsh. Wasn't admitting guilt and apologizing enough? Why did the judge seem so determined to make an example out of him? "Do you have anything else to add?" Whitaker asked, glancing up from the file. "No, Your Honor," Marcus replied evenly. "I've said everything I needed to say." Whitaker studied him for a moment longer, taking in the expensive suit, the polished shoes, the confident stance. Something about Marcus rubbed him the wrong way, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, as if he believed he was above the law. Or maybe it was just the fact that Whitaker had been having a bad day already, and this case was making it worse. Finally, the judge leaned back in his chair and picked up his gavel. "Very well. After reviewing the facts of the case, I find you guilty of reckless driving. The penalty will be a fine of $500 payable within 30 days. Court adjourned." With that, He slammed the gavel down onto the desk, the sound echoing loudly through the room. For a split second, Marcus looked like he might protest, but he quickly masked his reaction. Instead, he gave a slight nod, turned on his heel, and walked toward the exit without another word. As he passed by the bailiff, he muttered something under his breath, something too quiet for anyone else to hear. Back at the bench, Whitaker watched Marcus leave, a strange uneasiness settling in his chest. He told himself it was nothing, just fatigue from a long morning of hearings. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd made a mistake. Not legally, of course. The ruling itself was perfectly valid. No, it was something else, something he couldn't quite explain. As the courtroom emptied and silence returned, Whitaker leaned forward and rested his elbows on the desk. He stared at the empty spot where Marcus had been standing moments earlier, replaying the interaction in his mind. The man's calm demeanor, his articulate responses, his obvious intelligence. It all seemed out of place for someone caught speeding on a random Tuesday morning. And then, just as Whitaker was about to dismiss the nagging thought altogether, it hit him. What if Marcus Johnson wasn't just some ordinary citizen? What if there was more to him than met the eye? After the courtroom emptied out, Judge Harold Whitaker retreated to his chambers. It was a small, cozy room tucked away behind the main hall, far enough from the noise and bustle of the courthouse. The space smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, a scent that had become familiar over the years. Shelves lined the walls, crammed full of thick legal books and dusty files. His desk, usually tidy but now covered in loose papers, sat in the center of the room beneath a soft lamp. Whitaker slumped into his chair, still feeling uneasy about the earlier hearing. He couldn't stop thinking about Marcus Johnson. The calmness in his voice, the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence that seemed almost practiced. Something about the man didn't sit right with him. Was it arrogance? No, it wasn't that. Arrogant people tended to puff themselves up, talk too much, try to dominate the conversation. Marcus had been respectful, even polite. And yet there was something else lurking beneath the surface, something Whitaker couldn't quite name. Just then there was a knock at the door. Before Whitaker could respond, Laura Bennett, his assistant, poked her head inside. Laura was a young woman in her late 20s with short brown hair and a friendly smile. She always wore practical clothes. Today it was a simple gray blouse and black slacks, and she had a knack for keeping things organized when Whitaker's mind wandered off track. "Judge Whitaker?" she said softly, stepping fully into the room. "I brought those case files you asked for." "Thank you, Laura," Whitaker replied, gesturing for her to place them on the desk. As she did, he noticed one particular folder sticking out from the pile. It had a bright red tab, marking it as urgent. Curious, he reached for it and flipped it open. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, a standard briefing document for an upcoming trial. But as he skimmed further, his eyes widened. "Laura," he said suddenly, his voice sharper than intended. "What is this?" She leaned closer, peering at the file. "Oh, that's part of the federal investigation led by Marcus Johnson. You know, the prosecutor who's been working on corruption cases involving local law enforcement." Whitaker froze. "Wait, what did you say?" "Marcus Johnson," Laura repeated, looking confused. "He's heading up the task force investigating allegations against judges and police officers accused of misconduct. Why? Is something wrong?" The room seemed to spin slightly as Whitaker processed her words. Marcus Johnson, the same Marcus Johnson who had stood before him less than an hour ago, calmly accepting a hefty fine for reckless driving, was a federal prosecutor. Not just any prosecutor either. This guy was leading a high-profile investigation into corruption within the very system Whitaker worked in every day. For a moment, Whitaker felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. He stared blankly at the file, his mind racing. How could he have missed this? Hadn't he checked Marcus's background during the hearing? No, he realized grimly. He hadn't bothered. Why would he? Traffic violations were routine, mundane. Nobody expected someone like Marcus to show up in his courtroom. "Judge Whitaker?" Laura's voice cut through his thoughts. "Are you okay?" He blinked. forcing himself back to reality. "Yes, I'm fine," he muttered, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just surprised, I guess." Laura hesitated, clearly sensing that something was bothering him. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Whitaker shook his head slowly. "No, not right now. Thank you, Laura. That'll be all." Once she left the room, closing the door gently behind her, Whitaker let out a heavy sigh. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples with his fingers. What had he done? Had he really just fined a federal prosecutor $500,000 for speeding? Worse yet, had he treated him dismissively, as if he were just another ordinary citizen? The thought made his stomach churn. He tried to rationalize it. After all, Marcus had been speeding. It wasn't like Whitaker had fabricated the charge. And technically, the law applied equally to everyone, regardless of their profession or status. Still, the timing of it all felt suspicious. Why would a federal prosecutor end up in traffic court unless he wanted to send some kind of message? As the minutes ticked by, Whitaker grew increasingly restless. He needed answers, and he needed them soon. Picking up the phone on his desk, he dialed. "Laura's extension?" "Yes, Judge Whitaker," she answered promptly. "Laura, I need you to arrange a private meeting with Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice firm. "Tell him it's regarding today's hearing. Make it clear that it's important." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Of course, Your Honor. When would you like to meet him?" "As soon as possible," Whitaker replied. "Today, if he's available." "I'll take care of it," Laura assured him before hanging up. Hanging up the phone, Whitaker sat back in his chair again, staring at the ceiling. He knew he couldn't undo what had already happened, but maybe, just maybe, he could salvage the situation. If he played his cards right, perhaps Marcus wouldn't hold today's ruling against him. After all, prosecutors understood how the system worked, didn't they? They knew that judges sometimes made snap decisions based on limited information. But, deep down, Whitaker wasn't so sure. Prosecutors also understood fairness, or at least they were supposed to. And if Marcus felt that Whitaker had treated him unfairly, it could spell trouble. Trouble not just for Whitaker personally, but potentially for the entire courthouse. Federal investigations weren't known for their subtlety, especially when corruption was involved. By late afternoon, Laura knocked on his door again. "Judge Whitaker, I spoke with Mr. Johnson," she reported. "He agreed to meet with you, here at the courthouse after hours around 6 o'clock. Relief washed over Whitaker, though it was tinged with anxiety. 6 o'clock gave him a few more hours to prepare, but it also meant he'd have to face Marcus sooner rather than later. "Good work, Laura," he said, managing a weak smile. "Let me know if anything changes." With that settled, Whitaker spent the next couple of hours reviewing the details of Marcus's investigation. From what he gathered, the task force was targeting several high-ranking officials suspected of accepting bribes, tampering with evidence, and coercing plea deals. Some of the names mentioned in the report were familiar to Whitaker. Not close friends exactly, but colleagues he'd crossed paths with over the years. The idea that any of them might be corrupt turned his stomach. At 5:45, Whitaker straightened his tie and adjusted his robe one last time before heading to the designated meeting room. It was a smaller, quieter space than his usual courtroom, designed for private discussions. A single table sat in the middle, surrounded by chairs. Whitaker took a seat at the head of the table, folding his hands in front of him as he waited. Promptly at 6 o'clock, the door opened, and Marcus Johnson walked in. He looked much the same as he had earlier that day, calm, composed, and impeccably dressed. But there was a new edge to his expression, a hint of curiosity mixed with caution. "Judge Whitaker," Marcus greeted him, his voice smooth and measured. "You wanted to see me?" Whitaker nodded, gesturing for Marcus to sit. "Yes, thank you for coming, Mr. Johnson. I wanted to discuss what happened earlier today, specifically my ruling in your case." Marcus raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, waiting for Whitaker to continue. "I realize now that I may have handled things poorly," Whitaker admitted, choosing his words carefully. When I fined you for reckless driving, I wasn't aware of your position as a federal prosecutor. Had I known, I might have approached the matter differently. Marcus studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. I appreciate your honesty, Judge Whitaker, but I have to ask, why does my profession matter? Shouldn't the law apply equally to everyone, regardless of their job title? Whitaker flinched inwardly. Of course, Marcus would bring that up. It was exactly what he'd said during the hearing. You're absolutely right, Whitaker conceded. The law should apply equally. However, I also recognize that context matters. If I came across as dismissive earlier, I apologize. That wasn't my intention. Marcus nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied with the apology. For now. Apology accepted, he said. But I hope you understand why incidents like this raise concerns. People look to judges to uphold fairness and impartiality. When those expectations aren't met, trust in the system erodes. Whitaker swallowed hard, nodding again. I understand completely, and I assure you, I'll reflect on my actions moving forward. In fact, I'd welcome any advice you might have on addressing implicit bias in the courtroom. Marcus smiled faintly, a glimmer of approval in his eyes. That's a good start, Judge Whitaker. We all have blind spots. The key is recognizing them and taking steps to improve. They talked for another 20 minutes discussing broader issues of fairness and accountability in the justice system. By the time Marcus left, Whitaker felt a mixture of relief and determination. He still had a lot to learn, but at least he'd taken the first step toward making amends. As he locked up his chambers for the night, Whitaker couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was only the beginning. Little did he know just how true that would turn out to be. The meeting between Judge Harold Whitaker and Marcus Johnson stretched longer than either of them had expected. At first, the conversation was formal and cautious, like two strangers feeling each other out before deciding whether to trust one another. But as the minutes passed, the tone shifted. Marcus didn't mince words. He made it clear that while he wasn't personally offended by the fine, he found Judge Whitaker's dismissive attitude troubling. You see, Your Honor, Marcus said, leaning forward slightly in his chair. It's not about the money. $500 isn't going to break me. What concerns me is the message it sends when someone in your position treats a citizen, any citizen, with such indifference. It reinforces the idea that some people matter more than others. Whitaker listened intently, his hands clasped tightly, together on the table. He knew Marcus was right, even if hearing it stung. For years, Whitaker had prided himself on being fair and impartial, but now he wondered if he'd been fooling himself. Had he let biases creep into his decisions without realizing it? The thought unsettled him deeply. I understand what you're saying, Mr. Johnson, Whitaker replied, his voice quieter than usual. And I take full responsibility for my actions today. If I came across as dismissive, I apologize. That wasn't my intention. Marcus studied him for a moment, his dark eyes searching Whitaker's face for any hint of insincerity. Finally, he nodded. Apology accepted. But apologies aren't enough, Judge Whitaker. What matters is what comes next. Are you willing to reflect on this and make changes where needed? Yes, Whitaker said without hesitation. Absolutely. I want to do better, to be better. For the next 20 minutes, they discussed ways to address implicit bias in the courtroom. Marcus shared examples from his own experience as a prosecutor, describing how certain defendants were treated differently based on their appearance, background, or socioeconomic status. Whitaker listened carefully, taking mental notes. He realized that these weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a larger problem within the justice system. As the conversation wound down, Marcus stood up, signaling that it was time to leave. Thank you for reaching out, Judge Whitaker, he said, extending his hand. Not everyone would have done that. You've taken an important step tonight. Whitaker shook his hand firmly, grateful for the kind words. Thank you for coming, Mr. Johnson, and thank you for your honesty. I'll do everything I can to ensure something like this doesn't happen again. With that, Marcus left the room, leaving Whitaker alone with his thoughts. For a while, he sat there in silence, staring at the empty chair where Marcus had been sitting. The weight of the evening's discussion pressed heavily on him, but beneath it all, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this could be a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire courthouse. Over the next few days, Whitaker couldn't stop thinking about Marcus's investigation. Out of curiosity, he began digging deeper into the details, poring over news articles and legal briefs during his free time. What he discovered shocked him. Dozens of allegations had surfaced against judges and police officers accused of corruption. Everything from accepting bribes to manipulating evidence to protect powerful individuals. Some of the names mentioned in the reports were people Whitaker had known for years, colleagues he'd respected and trusted. One name in particular caught his attention: Richard Dawson. Dawson was a defense attorney with a reputation for winning cases no matter the cost. Known for his charm and cunning, he often represented high-profile clients who seemed untouchable. Whitaker had crossed paths with Dawson several times over the years and always found him slippery, though he'd never suspected anything illegal. Now, however, Marcus's investigation suggested otherwise. According to the documents Whitaker read, Dawson was allegedly tied to organized crime, using his connections to intimidate witnesses and sway juries. The more Whitaker learned, the more uneasy he became. He couldn't ignore the possibility that some of his own rulings might have been influenced indirectly by Dawson's schemes. Was it possible that he'd unknowingly played a role in perpetuating corruption? The thought haunted him, gnawing at his conscience day and night. Determined to find answers, Whitaker decided to reach out to Marcus again. This time he called Laura Bennett into his office to arrange a private lunch meeting. "I need to speak with Mr. Johnson urgently," he told her. "Something has come to my attention that I believe he should know about." Laura nodded, already accustomed to Whitaker's growing interest in the case. "Of course, Your Honor. I'll set it up right away." 2 days later, Whitaker met Marcus at a small cafe near the courthouse. The restaurant was cozy, with warm lighting and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. They chose a corner booth where they could talk privately, away from prying ears. "Thank you for meeting me on such short notice, Mr. Johnson," Whitaker began after they ordered their drinks. "There's something I need to share with you." Marcus leaned back in his seat, studying Whitaker closely. "Go ahead, Judge Whitaker. I'm listening." Taking a deep breath, Whitaker launched into an explanation of what he'd uncovered about Richard Dawson. He described the patterns he'd noticed over the years, cases that seemed suspiciously lopsided, outcomes that defied logic, whispers of behind-the-scenes deals. While he didn't have concrete proof, he believed his observations could help Marcus build a stronger case. When he finished speaking, Marcus sat quietly for a moment, processing the information. Then he looked at Whitaker and said, "You're taking a big risk by sharing this, Judge Whitaker. If Dawson finds out, it could put you in danger." "I know," Whitaker admitted, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. "But I can't stay silent anymore. If I've unwittingly contributed to corruption in this system, I owe it to myself, and to the public, to make things right." Marcus nodded slowly, clearly impressed by Whitaker's courage. "You're doing the right thing," he said, "and I promise you your information will be handled carefully. We'll use it to strengthen our case, but we'll also protect you as much as possible." Relieved, Whitaker allowed himself a small smile. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I appreciate that." As they continued talking, Marcus outlined the next steps in the investigation. He explained that they were planning to present key evidence during an upcoming trial involving one of Dawson's clients, a wealthy businessman accused of embezzlement. If everything went according to plan, the trial would expose not only the defendant's crimes but also the corrupt network supporting him. By the end of the meal, Whitaker felt a renewed sense of purpose. For so long, he'd felt powerless, trapped in a system that seemed beyond repair. But now, for the first time in years, he saw a glimmer of hope. By working with Marcus, he could help bring justice to those who deserved it and hold accountable those who had abused their power. As they parted ways outside the cafe, Marcus turned to Whitaker and said, "Remember, Judge Whitaker, change Starts with people like you. People who are willing to look inward and take action. Don't underestimate the impact you can have. Whitaker watched as Marcus walked away, his words echoing in his mind. Change started with people like him. The realization filled him with both fear and determination. Fear because he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Determination because he finally understood what was at stake, not just his career but the integrity of the entire justice system. That night, as Whitaker lay in bed, he replayed the day's events in his mind. He thought about Marcus's calm, confidence, his unwavering commitment to justice. He thought about the corrupt officials whose actions had eroded public trust, and most of all, he thought about the choice he'd made, to step forward instead of staying silent. It was a choice that would change everything. Judge Harold Whitaker had always prided himself on being cautious. He double-checked every decision he made in court, reviewed each case thoroughly, and avoided anything that might raise suspicion about his integrity. But as he stepped out of the courthouse late one evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. His instincts were rarely wrong, and tonight, they were screaming at him to be careful. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint smell of rain. From earlier in the day, Whitaker tightened his coat around himself and quickened his pace toward his car, parked a block away in a dimly lit parking lot. As he walked, he glanced over his shoulder several times, but the streets appeared empty. Still, the uneasiness lingered like a weight pressing down on his chest. When he reached his car, he fumbled with his keys, trying to unlock the door as quickly as possible. Just as he slid behind the wheel, his phone buzzed loudly in his pocket, startling him. He pulled it out and saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. Hesitating for a moment, he answered cautiously. "Hello?" he said, his voice trembling. "Slightly, Judge Whitaker," came a low, gravelly voice on the other end. "We need to talk." Whitaker's heart sank. He recognized the voice immediately. It belonged to Richard Dawson, the defense attorney whose name kept popping up in Marcus Johnson's investigation. How did Dawson know Whitaker was involved? Had someone tipped him off? "What do you want?" "Mr. Dawson?" Whitaker asked, trying to sound braver than he felt. Dawson chuckled darkly. "I think you already know. Word gets around when people start poking their noses where they don't belong. You've been helping Marcus Johnson dig up dirt on me, haven't you?" Whitaker gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. "I don't know what you're talking about," he lied, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to stay calm. "Oh, come on, Judge," Dawson sneered. "Don't insult my intelligence. I know you've been feeding him information. And let me tell you something, you're playing a dangerous game. If you keep this up, you'll regret it. Your family will regret it too." The mention of his family sent a chill down Whitaker's spine. He thought of Emily, his wife, and Sophie, his teenage daughter. They had no idea what he'd gotten himself into. He couldn't bear the thought of them being dragged into this mess, or worse, harmed because of his actions. "I'm warning you, Judge," Dawson continued, his tone icy now. "Back off. Stop interfering, or there will be consequences." "Do we understand each other?" Before Whitaker could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone in his hand, his mind racing. What should he do? Should he call Marcus? Or would that only put him in more danger? For several minutes, he sat frozen in his car, unsure of his next move. Finally, he decided to reach out to Marcus, but not directly. Instead, he sent a text message through the secure channel they'd agreed upon during their last meeting. "They know. Be careful." Within moments, Marcus replied, "Understood. Stay safe. We'll handle this." Together, despite the reassurance, Whitaker couldn't shake the fear gripping him. He drove home slowly, constantly checking his rearview mirror for any sign of someone following him. When he arrived, he parked in the garage and hurried inside, locking the door behind him. Emily was in the kitchen preparing dinner while Sophie sat at the table doing homework. "Everything okay, Harold?" Emily asked, noticing the tension in his face. "Yes, fine," Whitaker lied, forcing a smile. "Just a long day at work." He wanted to tell her the truth, to warn her about the danger they might be in. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. She'd worry too much, and he didn't want to scare Sophie either, so instead he kept quiet, pretending everything was normal. Over the next few days, Whitaker became increasingly paranoid. He checked his phone constantly, expecting another threatening call or message. He avoided leaving the house unless absolutely necessary and took different routes to work to throw off anyone who might be tailing him. At night, he barely slept, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. Meanwhile, Marcus worked tirelessly to gather more evidence against Dawson and his associates. With Whitaker's help, they uncovered a trail of suspicious transactions, linking Dawson to organized crime figures. Phone records showed frequent communication between Dawson and key players in the corruption network, including judges and police officers implicated in Marcus's investigation. One evening, Marcus called Whitaker to update him on the progress. "We're close," Marcus said, his voice filled with determination. "But we need one final piece of evidence, a witness willing to testify under oath. Without that, it'll be hard to prove anything beyond reasonable doubt." Whitaker nodded, even though Marcus couldn't see him. "Do you have someone in mind?" "Yes," Marcus replied, "an officer named Daniel Harper. He used to work closely with Dawson but recently left the force. He knows enough to blow this whole thing wide open. But getting him to cooperate won't be easy. He's scared." "I understand," Whitaker said. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Marcus hesitated before answering. "Actually, there is. I need you to meet with Harper tomorrow. He trusts you more than he trusts me. If anyone can convince him to come forward, it's you." Whitaker swallowed hard, knowing how risky this was. Meeting with a potential witness could expose both of them to retaliation, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. If Harper refused to testify, the entire case could collapse and Dawson would walk away scot-free. "All right," Whitaker said finally. "Tell me where and when." The next afternoon, Whitaker met Daniel Harper at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. Harper was a tall, wiry man in his 40s with deep circles under his eyes and a nervous energy that made him fidget constantly. He looked like someone who hadn't slept in weeks. "Thanks for coming, Judge Whitaker," Harper said, shaking Whitaker's hand weakly. "I wasn't sure if you'd agree to meet with me." "Of course," Whitaker replied, sitting down. Across from him, Mr. Johnson explained the situation. "I know how important your testimony is." Harper sighed heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I want to help. I really do. But you don't understand what these people are capable of. They've ruined lives, destroyed careers. If I go public, they'll come after me and my family." Whitaker leaned forward, his expression serious. "I know it's scary, Daniel. Believe me, I've been there. But staying silent won't protect you forever. These people will find a way to hurt you anyway. The only way to stop them is to fight back." For a long moment, Harper stared at Whitaker, weighing his words. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it. But I need protection. For me and my family." "You'll get it," Whitaker promised. "Marcus has connections with federal agencies. They'll make sure you're safe." Relieved but still anxious, Harper agreed to meet with Marcus later that week to discuss the details of his testimony. Whitaker left the cafe feeling hopeful for the first time in days. They were so close now, close enough to see the finish. But as Whitaker drove home, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. Dawson wouldn't go down without a fight, and Whitaker knew it. The real battle was just beginning. The day of the trial arrived and the courthouse buzzed with energy. Reporters crowded outside, cameras flashing as lawyers, witnesses, and members of the public filed in. Inside, the courtroom was packed, every seat occupied by curious onlookers, journalists scribbling notes and nervous individuals connected to the case in one way or another. At the center of it all stood Marcus Johnson, calm and composed, ready to present his case against Richard Dawson and his corrupt network. Judge Harold Whitaker sat at the bench, his face unreadable but his mind racing. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, poring over files and rehearsing testimony. Yet nothing could fully prepare him for the weight of what was about to unfold. Today wasn't just about proving guilt. It was about restoring trust in a broken system. And Whitaker knew that every word spoken, every piece of evidence presented, would be scrutinized not only by the court, but by the entire community. As the proceedings began, Marcus took charge. He approached the podium with confidence, his voice steady and clear as he addressed the judge and jury. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "today we are here to expose a web of corruption that has undermined justice in our city. This isn't just about one individual. It's about a system that has allowed powerful people to manipulate the law for their own gain." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "We have gathered substantial evidence showing how Richard Dawson, a defense attorney, has conspired with judges, police officers, and organized crime figures to obstruct justice. Through bribes, intimidation, and coercion, they have ensured favorable outcomes for wealthy clients while leaving ordinary citizens to suffer the consequences." Marcus gestured toward a large screen behind him, where key pieces of evidence were displayed. Bank records showing suspicious transactions, phone logs revealing frequent communication between Dawson and implicated officials, and photographs linking him to known criminals. One document in particular caught everyone's attention: a signed affidavit from Daniel Harper, the former officer who had agreed to testify under protection. "Let's start with Exhibit A," Marcus said, pointing to the affidavit. "This statement comes from Daniel Harper, a brave whistleblower who risked his life to bring the truth to light. According to Mr. Harper, Richard Dawson orchestrated schemes to tamper with evidence, intimidate witnesses, and even bribe judges to secure victories for his clients." Whitaker watched intently as Marcus laid out the case methodically, piece by piece. Each revelation seemed to send ripples through the room. Some jurors exchanged glances, others leaned forward, hanging on every word. Even Dawson, seated beside his own lawyer, appeared uneasy, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. When it came time for witness testimonies, Daniel Harper took the stand. Flanked by federal marshals for protection, he looked pale but determined. Under Marcus's gentle questioning, Harper recounted years of working under Dawson's influence, how he'd been pressured to falsify reports, alter evidence, and turn a blind eye to misconduct. His voice trembled at times, but his resolve never wavered. "I didn't realize how deep it went until later," Harper admitted, his eyes scanning the courtroom. "At first I thought it was just shortcuts, ways to make cases easier to handle. But then I saw innocent people going to prison because of lies we told. I couldn't live with myself anymore." Harper's testimony struck a chord with the jury, many of whom nodded sympathetically. Whitaker found himself gripping the edge of his bench, overwhelmed by the courage it must have taken for Harper to come forward. It reminded him of his own decision to cooperate with Marcus, a choice that still felt fraught with danger but undeniably right. After Harper stepped down, Marcus called Judge Whitaker to the stand. The move surprised some in the gallery, including Emily, who sat nervously in the back row clutching Sophie's hand. Whitaker rose slowly, aware of all eyes on him as he walked to the witness box. Taking a deep breath, he swore to tell the truth. "Your Honor," Marcus began, addressing Whitaker formally despite their close collaboration. "Can you describe any irregularities you've observed during your tenure as a judge? Specifically, patterns involving cases handled by Mr. Dawson?" Whitaker cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. "Over the years, I've noticed certain trends that raised red flags. For example, there were instances where defendants represented by Mr. Dawson received unusually lenient sentences, despite overwhelming evidence against them. Other times, trials were delayed inexplicably, giving his clients more time to prepare or pressure witnesses." Marcus nodded, encouraging Whitaker to continue. "Did you ever report these concerns to anyone?" "No," Whitaker admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "I should have, but I didn't want to rock the boat. Looking back, I see now that silence only enabled the corruption to continue." His honesty resonated with the jury, who exchanged approving glances. By admitting his own failures, Whitaker humanized the issue, making it clear that no one, not even judges, was immune to the pressures of the system. As the prosecution wrapped up its case, Dawson's lawyer attempted to discredit the evidence, accusing Marcus of exaggerating and manipulating facts. But his arguments fell flat in the face of such damning proof. Even the judge presiding over the trial, a colleague of Whitaker's, seemed unimpressed, frequently interrupting with pointed questions. By the end of the day, the courtroom felt electric with anticipation. Journalists rushed to file their stories speculating about the verdict. Outside, crowds gathered, holding signs demanding justice. Whitaker stayed behind long after the session ended, reflecting on the enormity of what had transpired. For months, he'd lived in fear of retaliation, unsure if he was doing the right thing. Now, standing on the brink of accountability, he felt a profound sense of relief and hope. Change was possible. Justice could prevail, even in the darkest corners of the system. But as he locked up his chambers and prepared to leave, a shadow crossed his mind. What if Dawson retaliated anyway? What if the fight wasn't over yet? Little did Whitaker know the final chapter was still waiting to be written. The days following the trial were tense for Judge Harold Whitaker. While the prosecution had presented overwhelming evidence against Richard Dawson and his corrupt network, Whitaker couldn't shake the feeling that danger still lurked around every corner. He knew Dawson wouldn't go down quietly, and people like him rarely played fair. One evening, as Whitaker sat alone in his study reviewing notes from the trial, his phone buzzed loudly on the desk. Startled, he picked it up and saw another unknown number flashing on the screen. For a moment he hesitated, remembering Dawson's earlier threats. But curiosity and a sense of duty pushed him to answer. "Judge Whitaker," came a gruff voice on the other end. "This is Detective Miller with the Chicago Police Department. We've arrested Richard Dawson." Whitaker's heart skipped a beat. "What happened?" "We received an anonymous tip about a meeting Dawson was planning to attend, a secret rendezvous with one of his associates. When we raided the location, we found incriminating documents linking him directly to illegal activities. He's currently in custody." Relief washed over Whitaker, though his guard remained up. "Thank you for letting me know, Detective. Is there anything else I should be aware of?" "For now, just stay vigilant," Miller advised. "Dawson has powerful allies who might try to retaliate, but rest assured we're keeping a close eye on things." After hanging up, Whitaker allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't over yet, but this was a significant victory, a step toward dismantling the corruption that had plagued the justice system for so long. The verdict came 2 weeks later. The courtroom was packed once again, but this time the atmosphere was different. There was a palpable sense of anticipation, almost excitement, as the jury filed back into the room after hours of deliberation. Reporters leaned forward eagerly, pens poised to capture history. Spectators whispered nervously, their eyes glued to the foreman of the jury. When the foreman stood to deliver the decision, the room fell silent. "On all counts," he announced, his voice steady, "we find the defendant, Richard Dawson, guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by murmurs of disbelief and relief. Dawson slumped in his chair, pale and defeated, while Marcus Johnson exhaled deeply, a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. Whitaker, seated at the bench, felt a surge of pride, not just for himself, but for everyone who had worked tirelessly to bring justice to light. As the judge overseeing the case read out Dawson's sentence, several years in federal prison without parole, the crowd erupted into applause. Outside the courthouse, cheers echoed as news of the conviction spread. Protesters holding signs reading "Justice for All" celebrated openly, hugging one another and chanting slogans. Whitaker watched it all unfold from the steps of the courthouse, standing beside Marcus. The prosecutor turned to him and extended a hand. "You did good, Judge Whitaker. This wouldn't have been possible without your courage." Whitaker shook his hand firmly, gratitude swelling in his chest. "No, Mr. Johnson. This was your fight. I was just lucky enough to help." Behind them, Emily and Sophie approached carrying a bouquet of flowers. Emily smiled softly, her eyes glistening with tears. "We're so proud of you, Harold," she said, handing him the flowers. "You stood up for what's right, even when it was hard." Sophie hugged him tightly, her youthful enthusiasm infectious. "Does this mean everything's okay now?" she asked innocently. Whitaker chuckled, ruffling her hair. "It means we're moving in the right direction. There's still work to be done, but today feels like a new beginning." In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the trial became clear. Several judges and police officers implicated in Dawson's schemes resigned or faced charges of their own. Reforms were introduced to increase transparency and accountability within the justice system. Public trust, though fragile, began to rebuild. For Whitaker, life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such a tumultuous period. He threw himself back into his work, determined to lead by example. Every ruling he made, no matter how minor, was guided by fairness and integrity. He also started mentoring younger judges, sharing lessons he'd learned during the investigation, and encouraging them to confront their own biases. Marcus, too, continued his mission to root out corruption wherever it existed. Though his task force disbanded after the trial, its impact lingered. Prosecutors across the country looked to him as a model for pursuing justice fearlessly and fairly. Occasionally, he and Whitaker met for coffee to discuss ongoing cases, their bond strengthened by shared experiences. Despite the progress, Whitaker never forgot the risks they'd taken, or the sacrifices made along the way. Daniel Harper, for instance, had relocated under a new identity to protect his family. Though grateful for Harper's bravery, Whitaker often wondered if he'd ever feel truly safe again. It was a sobering reminder that fighting for justice sometimes came at great personal cost. One crisp autumn morning, Whitaker arrived at the courthouse early, eager to start the day. As he climbed the steps, he noticed something unusual. A group of students gathered near the entrance, listening intently to a teacher explaining the importance of civic responsibility. The sight warmed his heart. These young minds represented the future, a future where fairness and equality might not just be ideals but realities. Later that day, as he presided over a routine hearing, Whitaker reflected on how far he'd come. Once complacent, he now understood the weight of his role in shaping society. Every decision mattered, no matter how small. And while the road ahead would undoubtedly have challenges, he felt ready to face them. That evening, as he walked home, with Emily and Sophie, Whitaker paused to watch the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. For the first time in months, he felt at peace. Justice hadn't been easy to achieve, but it had been worth every struggle. "You know," Emily said, slipping her arm through his, "you've inspired a lot of people, Harold, including me." Whitaker smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "And you've kept me grounded when I needed it most. We make a good team." Sophie skipped ahead, laughing as she twirled in circles. Her joy was contagious, reminding Whitaker of simpler times before the chaos of the trial. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was beautiful in its imperfection. As they reached their front door, Whitaker took one last look at the horizon. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to do better. But for tonight, he allowed himself to bask in the glow of victory, knowing that justice, true justice, was finally within reach.